So, Chris, welcome. And
Thank you, Daniel, for having me. I'm happy to be
oh,
here.
thank you for coming. And also, thank you for sharing a copy of your book with me. Embodying Transnational Yoga is the title. And we're going to get into the subtitle, I think, a little bit more, the eating, the singing, and the breathing dimensions of yoga. Um, but also, really wanted to just say congratulations. Producing a book is no small feat. So well done.
Thank you very much. Yes, it was a long labor of love, as we say, and
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here the day after we did the book launch yesterday at SOAS, and you were there, and I'm very happy to be here to discuss it more with you. You can say whatever you want.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. I should probably say off the bat that I'll lower the tone somewhat from the scholarly heights of your discussion with Lara and with Jackie and some of the attendees last night. I really want to just go back to basics to start with and talk a little bit about how you got into yoga in the first place. It sounded like it was something you'd come to in your 20s, and that through yoga practice, you'd quite quickly been interested in yoga study. And I was wondering if you could talk us through a little bit how that happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's a very personal story, as I'm sure yoga is
Mm.
for you, I know, and so for so many other people who come to yoga, and it's in the title of my book, this transformation, right? There's a certain
Yes.
transformation or experience you have that keeps you coming back for more, whatever that is, and it's different in all these yoga communities. But for me, uh, in my early 20s, after I graduated from college, I was making a transition into being an accountant. I'm a CPA as well. And as I was making that transition, I had to support myself somehow financially. I wasn't able to do that yet with yoga. So I didn't even really know what yoga was at the time. And what I did during that time is I was actually working on the California wildfires. And so I write about this in the preface to the book to say, like, this is kind of what brings me into the world of samsara and suffering in
Yeah.
the sense that, I was on these wildfires in California, which we know are getting worse and worse. And I worked just grueling hours, backbreaking labor alongside California inmates who were out there, serving their time. And yeah, it was really, really difficult work. And
So
the
you're actually a firefighter, were you?
I was a part of the logistical support team, so I never actually became a firefighter. I was more so assisting those who were fighting the fire with setting up
Wow.
the base camps. So I would follow them around basically with our company and that I was working for, and we provided the logistical support. So we would set up the huge tents that they would sleep in, set up their air conditioning for them, provide the food tents, all these kinds of things that they needed to be able to camp out, so to speak, if you want to call it that. And so we were moving with them from place to place, location to location, up in the mountains in California where the fires are burning and raging, and very difficult, as you can imagine. It's very hot. We weren't eating, we didn't sleep, and this left its mark on me. It made it just, I had a heightened sense of anxiety, you could say, and all the things that happen when you go through an experience like that over and over again. So having gone through that, and also having scoliosis, as a lot of yoga practitioners do, I read about that in the preface of the book as well. I was really searching for some kind of relief, and I was a surfer. And at the time when I was surfing in my mid-20s in Southern California, I met my buddy Ryan, my surfing buddy Ryan. A little did I know Ryan was going to be, he and his brother Derek were going to be the founders of Yoga Glow, which we both probably know.
Oh, wow.
And I
Okay.
just happened to run into him when I was out in the water surfing, we're having a good time. Um, and so that became a real entry point for me, because what Ryan said to me out on the water one day, it had nothing to do with the fires or anything like that. But he said, you got to try yoga. It'll make your surfing so much better. And you just got to try yoga,
Mhm.
So he was kind of proselytizing to me about yoga. So my first yoga class was actually at Yoga Glow with Joe Tastula, who some may know, yoga teacher.
I actually did a teacher training with Joe earlier this year. So
Oh, fantastic.
small
Fantastic.
world.
Yeah, it's a small world of yoga, right? Even though there's so many of us. And Joe's class just gave me that yoga glow. I mean, I was just blissed out after that first yoga class. I remember going into my first downward dog, and Joe's like, "No, you got to go like this and all that." And after I was done, I was sold. I was like, "Okay, this is the thing that's gonna provide that relief I had been looking for, that peace of mind for so long." And so that's really how my entry point into yoga started. Yeah.
And was that how you got to know Chris? Chris Chappell? Because he was teaching for Yoga Glow as well, wasn't he?
He was, yes. And so I had already taken an undergraduate class with Chris at the university on Indic tradition. So it wasn't on yoga, but of course yoga was mentioned in there. Jain tradition was mentioned in there. And that class had a profound impact on me. And so by some, kind of karmic confluence, Chris was also at the time friends with Derek and Ryan at Yoga Glow, was invited to come teach at Yoga Glow. So this is a few years after I had graduated. I reconnected with Chris when he was teaching Patanjali's Yoga Sutra at Yoga Glow during this whole time, right? When all this is happening. So around this same time, I'm reconnecting with Chris Chappell there. We're going and listening to his weekly video discourses at Yoga Glow. And for the first time, like so many people, I'm like, oh, there's more to this than just the asanas. Oh, there's some philosophy behind this. And so that was my initial entry point into studying with Chris, and with whom I eventually also did a 2-year yoga teacher training based on his training at his ashram, which is the subject of the first chapter of the book. So we did a 2-year yoga teacher training where we were doing all the practices that I described there in the book: eating, singing, breathing, also of course asana and other things like that, meditation. But that was how I started to study with Chris.
And was that prior to him setting up the master's program in yoga studies at LMU?
That was prior to Chris setting up the master's studies program at LMU, yes. So it was probably 2 or 3 years before it started. We did this training with Chris at his separate yoga and meditation center, which was in Santa Monica, California. Exactly.
Because I actually went to see Chris a little more than 10 years ago when SOAS had just got up and running, and I was really excited about the prospect of studying yoga academically, and I hadn't actually heard of the SOAS program at that time. So I went to LA, met with Chris, and he told me about you at that time and explaining how you were researching the confluence of surfing and samadhi. And I was excited. I thought this is a sort of whole new field of opportunity for a slightly, directionless ex-journalist drifting. Maybe I could catch a wave of applying a little bit of intellectual rigor to my interest in yoga. So he was a very engaged and engaging person to talk to about that subject. Eventually, though, he said, there is this other program in London you might want to look into if you haven't got what it takes to pay all the fees to come and be a student in California, which I didn't. So that's how I ended up in London.
So expensive, right? To live in Los Angeles and everything. So yeah, I can definitely, and I know that you and I share this background as well of as practitioners at times being in India for various, trainings or yoga or whatever. And then part of my experience in that was that I took what you see behind me, my surfboard, with me to India. Now I'm a surf traveler because I'm in Zurich, right? I'm landlocked. But I went with my surfboard to India, and I met a group in the forest there in Puri in Orissa of people who called themselves surfing yogis. And that was when I did my master's thesis, I was kind of exploring the confluence of yoga philosophy and tantric philosophy and being in the elements and surfing in India with these surfing yogis. So it was like a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of ethnography. And that was prior, of course, to the yoga studies program that was there as well. But that was what I was exploring. And Chris actually came, he was in India for his research, and we met up, and he was body surfing. I was surfing at a small river mouth in Orissa, and just incredible waves. I mean, as you know, not too many people go into the ocean in India, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very dangerous there. And in fact, I've experienced myself some of the most dangerous waves in India because it's so pounding. It's incredible power there. But there's also like this mystical appeal of being surfing on the beach in India and just being on the beach in India that drew me back for more over and over again. So that became this initial research interest of mine, which I am still interested in. I haven't been able to go back as much due to a lot of family obligations and things, but surfing in India is fantastic. And yoga, of course.
I did think, if I remember rightly, that I'd seen you surfing in Switzerland even these days as a sort of a wave pooled. Is that right?
Yeah, they have the Alaya Bay in Valleys. So I sometimes it's about a 3-hour train ride from here. I can take my board with me or go even without. They have tons there. and you can surf the Alps, so to speak. I know that a mutual contact of ours, I believe it's Michaela in Ticino, was thinking
Yes.
about going recently too. So all the yogis here in Switzerland are even starting to get the surfing bug.
You're not tempted by snowboarding though, or is
That as
that,
well, yeah. Sometimes
yeah.
I go snowboarding now as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
So.
lots of crossover there too. I mean, I haven't done that in a long time, but that was one of my first ideas about sort of how yoga would improve my sporting endeavors, was that getting into postural yoga would really help me to tune into, you know, picking a line out on the mountain and not wiping out, which I used to do a little too often.
It certainly does, yeah. So the postural yoga has so many benefits. And I was writing an article a while back, it's somewhere on the internet, I have to find it, about the confluence of surfing and yoga in Hawaii with people like Jerry Lopez, who were on the North Shore of Hawaii, you know, meditating, doing all this Zen stuff during the counterculture, postural yoga. And Jerry Lopez, of course, still does all this stuff, you know, Mr. Pipeline, surfing these massive waves. But when he's on the sidelines, he's practicing yoga. And I was so intrigued by this confluence. And I felt like it was this natural confluence. Like if you're a surfer, of course you're a yogi. And if you know, it helps with all the concentration and body control that's required when you're out in these really critical situations, being able to control your breath. And so, yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Well, I hope you get to pick up that thread again, especially while some of those old timers are still around to talk to.
Right. That's right. Yeah. I have to go to Oregon now. So Jerry Lopez is now famously snowboarding, right? And he's snowboarding in Oregon where he lives now, and surfing on the river waves. So the story goes on. It would be a fascinating research project.
Well, that's actually very, I guess, harmonious with the theme of what you're writing about, this kind of ripple effect of the practices being in transformation as the locations change, and then also as the objectives of the practitioners change. And yoga, therefore, is in constant flux, in evolution. And that seemed to be the sort of, I guess, underlying connectivity between the three different case studies that you focus on in the book. Wonder if you could say a little bit more about what led you to focus on that dimension.
Yes, absolutely. So there's three main chapters in the book. The first one's about yogic diet, how yogis eat. The second one is about music, kirtan, right? And the third one is about pranayama. So what I'm really trying to do here is show how these practices move across the world into particular places where I was trained or inspired by to train. And how they transform when they do that. So how do yogic dietary practices change when they end up in Long Island, New York, is what happens in chapter 1 at Yoga Anand Ashram, right? Which is the ashram where Chris Chappell studied for 12 years and became kind of naturally my first field site. It was a lot of archival research and speaking with students who had trained there, and particularly during the counterculture, which is a really fascinating time, again, that intersects with surfing and all this stuff with Jerry Lopez. So that became my first site. And one of the main ways that they expressed their yogic identity and practice was through a commitment to ahiṃsā. And for them, that meant vegetarianism and opening a vegetarian restaurant. And so in this chapter, what I decided to do was, instead of focusing on asana, there's so much research on asana, which is great, and I teach it in class, but I wanted to talk about something different, right? So they're practicing asana there, but I wanted to show how really culturally what it meant to open up a vegetarian restaurant during the counterculture, during what's known as counter cuisine. There's all these restaurants opening all over the United States, including at this ashram. And they're doing it as not just as an expression of food justice, you know, against environmental harms of eating anything that comes from animals, or the harm against the animals, which is a broader concern in the counterculture. But they're also doing it as a direct and expression of Patanjali's ahiṃsā, right? So this chapter shows how you can still practice ahiṃsā on Long Island, New York, in this very particular way by really engaging with the counterculture and what the counterculture is doing. So that's chapter 1.
Could I just pop in there? I was
Absolutely.
very interested to see that, if I understood correctly, not only some of the people who were involved at the ashram, but even the guru herself were not 100% vegetarian. So it was a case of causing a bit less harm, but not necessarily eradicating completely.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so that was one of the things that came up in my research, was that there were some students. So Gurani Anjali is the female guru of this ashram. she promoted vegetarianism to the students. And during certain times, for example, like everybody would just practice vegetarianism. But when I started talking to people at the ashram, there were some people who were fully committed and are still vegetarian to this day. Chris Chappell, for example,
Yeah.
he's one of the people. And then there were other students who said, you know, sometimes I practiced it, sometimes I didn't. It was a kind of periodic reflection on ahiṃsā, and some people just simply didn't practice it. So when you start doing the ethnographic work, you start to realize that even kuṇḍalinī was, you know, people told me, was at times vegetarian, but coming from Bengal, where not everyone,
a lot of fish eating,
fish eating, right, was not strictly vegetarian herself. So it was seen as somehow a way of, at least for a partial period of time, taking on some kind of ascetic practice as a commitment to ahiṃsā. And also, as students conveyed, whoever did it, even if they didn't remain vegetarian, it still opened up their eyes to the manifold harms of not being vegetarian, of eating animals and so on. So yeah, there was a full range, a full spectrum of responses, so to speak, on the ground, as it was happening on the ground.
And I wonder how that sat with you as somebody who has become, you know, very vocal and active on this particular issue, having yourself become a vegan and keen to promote that as a lifestyle decision. And I wonder how, you know, how that jives, that sort of moderate approach, the watering down, the sort of a bit less harm rather than 100% non-harm.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I became vegan through my Jain studies, which we can talk about Jain yoga too if you want. So I was vegetarian as a result of studying with Chris in the 2-year teacher training and reading Gurani Anjali's writings about ahiṃsā and stuff like that. I decided to go full vegetarian at the time. So this is the 10 years ago, like, as you say, when you were interacting with him a little bit before that. And was just okay with that, and never really even thought about veganism or anything like that. And then when I was studying and preparing courses about 5 years ago, or 4 years ago now, I guess it was, for a course in Jain studies, which of course emphasizes ahiṃsā more than most traditions would, that was when I decided, in my interactions with the Jain Vegan Initiative and Jain vegans, to go fully vegan. Now, when I was, at the time I was doing my research, and I had done it already in my dissertation research, I had already kind of spoken to people who realized that, who made me realize that not everyone was vegetarian. And at first it was a shock to me. I was surprised, and I think, as most people are, when they get into their tradition more and more, they start to see things that they don't want to see, right?
Yes.
But I couldn't unsee it. You can't unsee it once you see it. And yeah, so I was a little bit disappointed, because you think you're practicing the pure and most holy and highest tradition, no matter what tradition you're in. That often happens to people, right? And then you have to kind of start admitting to yourself that not the world as you had perceived it as being a perfect demonstration of ahiṃsā or whatever, isn't that. And so, yeah, at first it had to settle in. I had to come to a point of acceptance that it just wasn't the way I thought it was. Although there were, of course, people who did. And now I'm the one trying to convince them, and I say them, all the countercultural vegetarians, no, you got to be vegan now too, you know. So it's kind of a funny thing that I'm the one now trying to convince them after they convinced me.
I also wonder how it sort of lands with you to be in India, where the fullest expression of pure vegetarian is maximum cow products.
Yeah, this is something that we discuss a lot in the Jain community, and that is that there's manifold harms connected with dairy, and most Jains are just vegetarian, right? They're not vegan. And so
Indeed,
there's so much, as you know, in India, as well as in the diaspora, there's so much dairy in all of the things that are floating around. So I would say I'm in a constant conversation of advocacy, and I'm actually going to be making a presentation later this week at the AAR in San Antonio about the ongoing debate within the Jain community, specifically between, you know, especially in India, advocating hard for dairy, like, you can't give this up, it's a cultural tradition. And then the Jain vegans, mostly in the diaspora, mostly young, who are saying, no, we have to be vegan for climate change and the animals and all these things like this. It's a constant debate. And so I'm actually writing a chapter about it right now, and I'm going to be presenting it at the AAR to kind of show arguments that are made on both sides.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. I look forward to hearing more about that, because I think, in the end, there is always dialogue, and tempting as it can be to see the the clear merits of one position, and to therefore imagine that it's almost an arguable point that everybody else should sign up to it. Not everybody agrees, and I think there needs to be some space for that disagreement to be in creative tension, and to allow each side to learn a little bit from the other, and perhaps to see the merits of, as I guess I started out on this line of inquiry, less harm still better than more harm, and even if it's still not ultimately no harm.
Yeah, and so I guess, and this is what the Jain Vegan Initiative tries to do, and they're well aware of this, is they're trying to push the needle, as they say, towards veganism in the community, well realizing that some people simply won't do it, and some will take some steps to do it. So I have some Jain friends who are like, that's great, you're vegan, and I eat about half vegan now. So it's a constant trying to push the needle in that direction, and it's basically based on the principle that the less dairy you consume, for them it's just basically dairy, right? They don't eat eggs. The less dairy you consume, the less harm you cause. It's in alignment with your principles. Dairy isn't made the same way it was made in the past. So it's trying to just show the community that things have changed, and if you want to do better, here's an opportunity to do better. Yeah, according to your own internal principles. Yeah.
And we're back to that principle again of transformation, and that things do not stay the same. And I'd like to backpedal a bit and just talk briefly about, actually what Jainism is, but also to observe, obviously, that, the ancient Vedic tradition that people sometimes like to imply yoga comes from was all about, throwing animals onto a fire. And it was not until later that this principle of non-harming was prioritized and associated with, practices of yoga. And that Patanjali, when he is in his Yoga Sutras talking about this principle of non-harming as part of a list of 5 precepts, is basically borrowing wholesale a list that in its earliest archive form that we have access to comes from the Jain religion, the 5 great vows. So I wonder if you could first tell us very, very briefly, from a yoga practitioner's point of view, what is Jainism and how does it relate to what we know as yoga?
Yeah, so I think you summarized that quite well, the borrowings there, the initial borrowing. So the Jain tradition it refers to people who follow the Jina, or Jinas. There's 24 liberated people who achieve liberation, the last of which, Mahavira, was a contemporary of the Buddha. So people can get a sense of historically, where are we? Around the 5th century BCE or so, right? And the Buddha and Mahavira, contemporaries, are leading these communities in Greater Magadha, so not in necessarily the same region of India as where the Vedic traditions are thriving, so to speak, but not totally isolated either. We're more in Eastern India. We're in Bihar with Mahavira. And these 2 traditions are trying to come to terms with what we know as samsara, the world of suffering. And they have a sort of shared commitment, even though they are sometimes in debate with one another. They have a shared commitment for how do we free ourselves from this suffering and rebirth, this wheel of the cycle of rebirth. And so the highest principle, the highest teaching that comes out of this tradition, you could say around the 5th century BCE, is supposedly from Mahavira, who commits himself to nonviolence and non-harming after he's been wandering around for 12 years or so, just meditating and practicing ascetic practices, fasting, all these things. And he has this realization when he's looking around him, and he goes, oh, everything is full of life and nothing wants to be harmed. And so for him, he commits to ahiṃsā as the highest spiritual principle, if you want to call it that, or principle of the tradition. And its aim later becomes to eliminate all of one's karma. So any action that we do, and there's that word karma that we know, right? Any action that we engage in, good or bad, causes karma. And when that karma is caused, we have to somehow eradicate it. So the best thing you can do in the Jain tradition is just avoid action altogether, especially harmful action, because yeah, you'll be reborn. What goes around comes around, and you will experience it yourself in a future lifetime, according to this tradition. So I don't know if that's a good introduction for your listeners to Jainism, or if you want me to add something to that. But Jains are those who follow the Jina. The Jina is Mahavira, this conqueror. It means a conqueror. He conquered his own passions. He conquered, according to the tradition, his impulse to cause harm, which is a very difficult thing to do, right? We all have these impulses in us, and we're on a spiritual path. We're trying to kind of come to terms with those. So that's what he is said to have done.
And coming back to the idea that Jains really take this to the next level, there is actually obviously a lot of unintentional harm that we don't even realize that we're causing, even at the level of, stepping on microorganisms and inhaling them by accident while we breathe. And so Jain monastics will sweep the ground in front of them before walking, or cover their mouths with a piece of cloth to make sure that that doesn't happen as far as they can. But even then, so I guess I'm left with the question of just how much harm is unavoidable through being a person living in society.
It's a good question. I think it's one that the Jains address by dividing the community into two principal groups. You have those who have taken the ascetic path, the monks and the nuns, who are the most committed to following rules to cause the least amount of harm as possible, right? Then you have the householders, you and I, people who are just trying to get by in life, who support them and feed them, vegetarian or vegan food, whatever it is. And we're living in two different worlds. So the householders have to make money, have to support families, have to pay the rent, as we do. And the ascetics are just wandering and really doing the least harm, having the least amount of possessions. And so they're seen to be supported on this journey. Their individual soul trying to achieve liberation is being supported by a lay community that itself, by its very nature, being part of the world, has to cause harm. But because karma is so individual in the tradition, they're seen to be supporting a very small minority of ascetics in their pursuit of that goal. And the lay people are hoping to achieve enough good karma in this lifetime so as to be reborn with the opportunity to be an ascetic in a future lifetime, so to speak, so that they will have the opportunity to then try to eradicate as much of their karma as possible.
Thank you. And would a Jain speak of yoga in that context? Is there such a thing as Jain yoga? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, there certainly is. And it really ties in with a lot of the themes we've been talking about so far. Some of the earliest references to yoga come in some of the earliest texts of the tradition. And the first mention that I've been able to find is in a second century BCE text, the Sutra Kirtanga Sutra. And in this text, it mentions that you, or a yogavan, someone who is possessed of yoga, is simply someone who is practicing restraint. So, and the word that's used for that, interestingly, is the same word that Patanjali uses, samyama. So in the earliest reference of yoga showing up in a text in the Sutra Kirtanga, it's basically saying that someone who practices restraint. And what that means is restraint in the sense of causing no violence in the world. So someone who practices yoga is someone who practices restraint. And that theme really carries through, I would say, Jain yoga as it develops all the way through into the contemporary period. So it has a long period of development that it follows and is in conversation with Buddhists, in conversation with Patanjali. As you mentioned, the 5 yamas, ahiṃsā and so forth, come from the Jain tradition. They're mentioned in these texts, these early texts. And so there is a Jain yoga, and it, in general, like you can very generally speaking say, it's tied to this notion of restraint in the perfection of one's conduct to eliminate one's karma.
And it seems to also have a relationship with Hatha yoga. If I remember rightly, there's a yoga shastra with a range of postural practices included, and perhaps more than one. It's Hemachandra is one that I'm familiar with, but I'm sure there are others that really are, again, sort of at the cutting edge of innovation in yoga traditions. And I wonder why we don't hear more about that in the broader sort of yoga world.
Yeah, I think Jain yoga and the Jain tradition in general is under-researched, especially in the yoga world, because the requirements of the tradition ask so much. I often hear that. So I'm trying to make it more popular now. I'm teaching a graduate seminar on it in about a year from now that I've been preparing, because I think it really is interesting, because it does include these elements that you mentioned, for example. So when you get into the medieval period and you have someone like Hemachandra in the 12th century writing the Yoga Shastra, he includes, following Patanjali's model, he includes not only a commitment to the Jain tradition, so he starts his text very committed to Jain conduct and so forth, and Jain knowledge. But as soon as he's done with setting that as that basis of what might be the yamas or so, and the niyamas in Patanjali, he gets into the later chapters and he starts giving postures. So I think that there's 9 or so postures listed actually in the text, and some more in the commentary. But the point is that for the first time in this text, you have postures that used to be only for ascetics being made for householders. So Kayot Sarga, for example, that we know, it's kind of like mountain pose, I guess.
Where you're forever.
Yeah, but forever, the perpetual. So before, it would be practiced by ascetics for like an amount of time. I mean, imagine standing in like a mountain pose for for a day or years or something, right? Like you've written about in your book, like these early ascetic practices they were no joke. You would stand for potentially years, right? Switching feet and stuff like that. But in the Yoga Shastra, he tones it down a lot. It's just for like a shorter period of time. Kayot Sarga means to kind of abandon the body. So that's what you're overcoming your attachment to your body. Very ascetic practice is now a practice that you can do for a shorter period of time to kind of meditate on, abandoning the body, but you're not actually going to abandon the body because you're a householder. But at least you burned some karma while you were there doing it, and then you get back to your everyday life, so to speak. So these postures do come in. Prāṇāyāma is there as well in Hemachandra's Yoga Shastra, all the way into meditation, which is also important in the Jain tradition.
And I remember when I was studying at SOAS, there was a Jain nun there who was teaching a Preksha Dhyana as a sort of anybody can drop in, have a go at it kind of practice. And that seemed, from what I picked up from your book, to also be another example of one of these sort of modern reformulations of an ancient idea in a householder accessible way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so Preksha Dhyana is probably, and I'm glad you had a chance to practice it too, so you know what it is, right? It's a modernized form of Jain yoga. And Andrea Jain also writes about this. I had cited her work in my book, yoga scholar Andrea Jain, that what happened with Preksha Dhyana, which was released in the 1970s, was that it was a formulation of all these principles of yoga that I've been talking about with you from earlier Jain times. But then they really add on to it contemporary postures that you would never probably find in a yoga text. I mean, it's been a long time since I've taken a Preksha class, but there's postural yoga that very much looks like a lot of the other postural yoga that we would do in another yoga studio, right? Tacked onto that. But then there's also, so those are the normal kind of classes, there's pranayama and stuff, but you can also commit to it, especially for ascetics as well, to meditation on subtle energy centers and colors and things in the subtle body, if you want to stick around for that, which isn't a requirement, of course. But what's so interesting about these systems is how they carry forward these kind of hatha yoga ideas from medieval yoga and things like this, and attach them still to these postures that we would be practicing today in the yoga studio that don't necessarily even come from medieval yoga, so to speak, but still retain some kind of commitment to burning karma, to having a perception of your higher self, so to speak, of your jiva, of your soul. So I think that's what that kind of accomplishes, that system.
Thank you. That explains it very clearly. And I think it leads us quite nicely into the second chapter of your book, looking at how, a rather sort of modern hybrid version of chanting, involving, all sorts of different instruments and even, Protestant inflected mantras, can still be a sort of portal towards the ultimate awakening of kuṇḍalinī and, dissolution in the internal sound. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that worked and why you chose to go and hang out in Hawaii with these Yogananda devotees.
Yeah, that was a really fun chapter to write. And who doesn't love kirtan? I mean, I've met a few people, but like even me, who I don't always go to kirtan. Whenever kirtan's around, and it's easy for me to go, I'd love to go to kirtan, right? It's an enjoyable practice, and it's done in so many different ways. And when I was in Hawaii, I was actually working as an accountant down the road at Kalani Honua, which is, they call it the Esalen of the Big Island. It's just a really magical place. I don't know, have you heard of it? Kalani?
No, I haven't, but it sounds like quite something if it's being compared to the hot tubs.
Yeah, it's really compared. They don't have the hot tubs, but they have the ocean right there as well. Anyways,
even better.
Totally beautiful place, and you can actually get in the water down there, and magical place on the big island of Hawaii. So if you're ever there, it's a great place to visit. Down the road from there, while I was there in the same area, there's a place called Polestar Gardens that was teaching the Kriya Yoga of Paramahansa Yogananda, who's of course a famous yoga guru. Most of us have probably heard of. Autobiography of a Yogi is his book, right? So their main thing was meditation, this Kriya Yoga meditation, but you had to be initiated to actually do it, right? Which takes quite a bit of dedication to wanting to be trained to do that. But in order to get people to even start meditating, they would play kirtan music, and it was lovely. And I was sort of like drawn in by the sounds, while I was working at Kalani. So I decided to go back there and write a chapter about them eventually in my dissertation in the book that looks at their kirtan ensemble specifically. And I think what struck me, one of the things that struck me while I was there, is not only are they using the harmonium, which we would expect to find probably in a modern kirtan practice, but they're also using the ukulele, the beautiful 4-string instrument that I don't know anyone who doesn't like the ukulele. I mean, I'm sure I'll meet someone someday.
I guess here is, have you ever heard of George Formby? In the UK, it's got an association with this comic Mancunian, I think he was, performer, and he had this song about when I'm cleaning windows, sort of strumming away on this banjo-like ukulele. But sorry, I distract you from the higher realms.
No, I mean, so that will probably come into a kirtan ensemble at some point too then. I mean, what was cool is like all these instruments were converging. But of course, Yogananda wasn't playing the ukulele. And of course, nobody in India was playing the ukulele, right? So what I started to ask myself is, why can the ukulele be such an effective instrument for creating devotional music that can draw us into Yogananda's meditation, which at its core, if you look at it, is a hatha yoga kind of subtle body meditation, if you get into the advanced stages of that. But they're using the ukulele to initiate that. And to me, it just struck me as like, this is an instrument that we play, as you just did. We play it for fun, right? We play it, and we did play it for fun sometimes out on the beach. We'd be playing and whatever. It was a good time, but it was being used in the temple, the meditation temple, as a way to listen to this, to then initiate a meditation on an unstruck internal sound within oneself. And I found it to be so effective, and people described it as being so effective. So what I did in this chapter is I just was like, where is all this? How does this all come together? So if you read the chapter, it's a really fun story, I think, about the history of the harmonium and how it's really a colonial
Well,
object.
that is a fascinating story. Could you just walk us through that in case people aren't aware? I mean, harmonium sort of seems synonymous, as you say, with kirtanwalas, but actually it's a Protestant portable organ.
That's right. So this history is really fun, right? Because here you have this European instrument that was used by Protestant missionaries, brought, as you say, to India to sing hymns. And what the Indians do with it, it was a foot-pumped organ at first kind of thing. What the Indians do is they're like, this is a cool instrument, but we're going to chop the legs off. We're going to put a hand pump on it, and we're going to make it our own. So that happens in the early 20th century. By the time of the early 20th century, it becomes an Indian instrument. They made it their own, right? So the floor pumped model was invented by Indians, but it was taken from this European instrument that had been brought in by the missionaries into India. And then what happens is it becomes a very contentious instrument, because some Indians love it because it's so easy to learn how to play. It's portable. It's easy to fix. It keeps its tune. We know all the wonderful things about the virtues of the harmonium. And some people hate it. They're like, no, it's a Western instrument. It can't make the right sound for Indian music. But what ends up happening by the time Yogananda has his hands on it is like, most people are okay with it. Most people have accepted it. And when it comes back to the West, it's exported back out to the West by people like Yogananda and many others, of course. And it becomes this transnational instrument that everyone just associates with kirtan, which everyone just associates with India. And so what I show in this chapter is this kind of very complex social history of this instrument that we all take to be kind of paradigmatically Indian. I show that it's a transnational instrument that's been created in the confluence of all these influences. But yet, like the ukulele is so powerful in kirtan and in meditation, as I'm sure many of us have experienced.
And the contents of the chanting as well seem to be this similar kind of hybrid. I mean, Yogananda in Autobiography of a Yogi is littering it with all of the sort of remnants of his Christian education to show how similar yoga philosophy is to the Bible in some way. And it seems that that's led to this similar sort of hybrid production of chanting. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that drew me to Yogananda and still draws me to him was his ability to make it what seems like a seamless conjunction between his kind of yoga tradition, Kriya yoga tradition, and Christianity and Jesus, who's part of his kind of pantheon, you know, whenever you're there in an SRF center at Polestar. And one of the ways he did that, of course, he did it with his writings, many of his writings on the Gita that kind of make it harmonious with Christianity. But one of the other ways he did that was to allow Christian lyrics to be sung, or lyrics that sounded Christian. He thought it was great that the sacred music could be sung. For example, "Oh God Beautiful," which is a translation of a song from India, right? Mm-hmm. He sings it in English, "Oh God Beautiful," and he does it at Carnegie Hall. And according to, you know, the hagiographical or popular story, the way it goes, he's like, I sung this thing with the audience for like, I think it's like 90 minutes, and people were having healing and were just so blissed out, having contact with God and all these experiences. But, you know, the song he's singing is a translation of a song into English, and yet people are still having these transformative experiences. Why is that? Well, what I'm able to do in the chapter, at least, is show how Yogananda is at least drawing from a 13th century, very tantric musicology that says that sacred music, really of any kind, is the entry point to experience the absolute, or God, or the divine, or however you want to conceive of it. And so the chapter traces that 13th century text all the way through to the influences that Yogananda had, that allowed him to have this very flexible ensemble, flexible lyrical approach to music, sacred music, that eventually allows the ukulele to enter to apparently accomplish the same goals.
How far can one take that process then? You know, is there a difference when Americans or other Westerners might choose to graft their own ideas on top of it and take it in a whole new direction to what was there when Yogananda was doing it? I wonder if you could say a little bit about that dimension also.
Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned in the chapter is there's some people who are initiated into the Kriya yoga tradition, very committed and very understanding of what Yogananda was trying to teach and do, right? And they've been practicing it for years. So for them, they're really following it to the T as best they can, trying to subscribing to the system and practicing it the way that Yogananda has supposedly taught for a long time, even though some of that has apparently been changed by the SRF and other organizations. But then you have this other group of people who are kind of showing up to the community and doing the kirtan practices, coming in and jamming and just letting it all out and fully participating to the best of their ability. And then they describe the experience for themselves as like, you know, my kuṇḍalinī was spinning out of my head. There's, you know, I mentioned one of those. So you get this range of experiences of people trying to describe some kind of transcendent experience that they had just from the music alone, right? So I think that's the fun thing about doing ethnography, studying these cultures closely, is seeing the range of experiences that people are said to have, you know, or that they claim to have had through the music. So I leave it as an open-ended question. I guess I'm always interested to know what people are experiencing when they're doing this. But, you know, one of the common things you hear in the Yogananda community for people who really practice over and over and over again is that they, you know, they'll see light in their third eye when they're meditating. You'll see that described in people's experiences of meditation at many yoga communities. So I think, you know, there's some continuity, some kind of mystery, something has come over with Yogananda's teachings and remains all the way over then in Hawaii at the time when we're there. And it's that magic and that mystery that I don't want to say, you know, I know what it is or I know how it happens or whatever, but there was something there still happening, despite the fact that all these things converge, and yet there was also so many other things happening as well. So yeah,
I'm curious though, as a scholar, how this all sort of fits together, because there's a sort of a tendency that creeps in all of the case studies, particularly towards the end as you're tying threads together, to really critically question some of the hybrid versions of things, particularly in the context of the white Western remodeling, and I just sort of wonder what insight that actually brings in some ways, because there's obviously, as you say, this thriving potential for transformation through the transformation of the practices. Does it really matter who's doing the transforming or what it's shaped by? Because there was quite a lot of analysis in the food chapter of the whiteness of 1970s clean eating, for want of a better word of expressing it, tendencies, as if that somehow devalued the promotion of vegetarianism, or ought at least to make us question it on some level. I'm not quite sure where the questioning takes us.
Yeah, it was a process for me of encountering myself in a lot of these chapters as well, my own emplacement. And so I think what I try to balance in the book is a sympathetic approach to, like, yeah, these things work, and these gurus really brought something special abroad. There's something special here. And then when you look at the communities culturally, as a scholar has to do, and you pay attention, you see that, yes, it's predominantly white. It's predominantly middle class, very privileged people who are even able to undertake these practices. So what I try to balance in the chapter, or in the book, I guess you could say, is an analysis between the transformative power and potential of these practices, without losing sight of the fact that these are the people who are doing it, right? The counterculture, I'm drawing from other scholarship to show how the counterculture and these countercultural food ways that people are participating in, the vegetarianism and so forth, was a predominantly, though not entirely, it was a very white thing, definitely, very middle class. And when I get into chapter 2, I talk a little bit about how the United States took Hawaii away from the Kingdom of Hawaii. And so the land that this is being practiced on is essentially stolen land, right? Colonized land. So the people who are there, they're not really concerned about that because it happened so long ago, but they, it's like a social fact and historical fact I don't really want to overlook. And in chapter 3, I really look at how neo-colonial, we can talk about this later, but how air pollution isn't just caused in India because of India. It's at the confluence of all these transnational influences that cause India to have to pollute in order to kind of stay up with geopolitics and economics. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't want to call them good and bad and all that stuff, but I'm trying to take like a sympathetic and yet critical approach in this book. And I think, as you know, because you're also a yoga scholar, you at some point you will encounter disturbing social facts in anything, either historically or today. And somehow you have to be able to hold both of those things at the same time, the difficult social reality, but also without throwing out the fact that these practices still have some kind of transformative potential despite those facts, right?
Well, that's a very helpful clarification, because I think sometimes the nature of scholarly discourse almost leaves that question a bit less open. It's almost building to this crescendo of and this is almost the conclusion at the end of your 3rd chapter, which we'll get onto in a moment, is sort of something terrible is going on here, rather than something magical is happening, but there are some difficult issues that we also shouldn't lose sight of. So to clarify that, let's move on to the prāṇāyāma in the midst of air pollution, which I've experienced myself at the Arihanta Institute in Pune, deeply inhaling traffic fumes, and often questioning quite why I was doing that, because it'd be a lot nicer to go somewhere more rarefied and breathe clean air. And yet, I was there and I went along with the program. And obviously, a lot of other people, as you rightly point out, don't have any choice. That's where they live. So if they're going to engage in these practices, that will be what they have to confront. And you were at least in a hill station outside of Mumbai, so a little bit less polluted, but still pretty polluted. And you were confronted by the same questions. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that experience and also how you tried to balance that tension.
Yeah, it was a really interesting transition when I went to India as my 3rd field site, right? So it's my last field site. So the book moves chronologically. when I was in Hawaii, people bragged and loved to talk about how the Big Island, and particularly the region where we were on the Big Island, supposedly has the world's cleanest air, right? So you're just breathing in, supposedly, and I think it is quite clean air. When I go to India, then to Lonavala, which is near Pune, right? Not far away.
Yep.
It's like
on the road.
on the road, right? On the expressway. So I'm glad you can relate to this experience because you were there. It's the opposite, right? You're breathing some of the world's most polluted air. Now, like you said, like Lonavala is a little bit less polluted than Mumbai or Pune because of its location as a hill station. But when you look at the actual data, and I include a bit of that in the book of how polluted the air is, it's still not healthy to be breathing that air. Now, compared to a major city, yes, it's healthier, of course. But what I'm really looking at in that chapter is the way that the Hatha Yoga body, as we know, if we read these popularized Hatha Yoga texts that we all know, part of the process of Hatha Yoga is to purify the subtle channels, the nadis, the subtle body, let's say, right? As a kind of preliminary to other yogic experiences and practices that come later in the texts, right? It's part of the, I guess, Hatha Yoga built-in logic. And so what's happening there at Kaivalya Dham, where they have a yoga hospital to help people who have a lot of ailments to recover using yoga, some yoga practices.
And you found them very, very effective at that. You were saying last night, I think, that you had a back problem that they healed for you.
Yeah, so also when I was in Hawaii, I hurt my back playing volleyball really bad, to the point where I was going to go to the ICYER, the International Center for Yoga Education and Research in Pondicherry. Some people may know that place. Another great yoga therapy place, and they do a lot of interesting things there. But I couldn't go because I hurt my back so bad when I was in Hawaii. But I still wanted to go. I was really interested in Kaivalya Dham, and I talked to some people. I talked to Chris Chappell and my friend Rachel Hammerline. Some of you may know Rachel, who was very helpful. And they're like, a lot of people told me, go to Kaivalya Dham. And I went there, and they have a yoga hospital, among many other things. And one of the things they teach there to help people get better is not only asana, which we did, but also pranayama, at least 2 times a day, pranayama practices. And I mean, long story short, with regard to my back, I went through the yoga therapy sequence for the months that I was there. And by the end, I mean, when I got there, I could barely walk. By the time I left, I would say like 90% healed or so. I was almost, and when I got back, I quickly healed. So, despite it's this thing of like, they know what they're doing, and that whatever they did was almost like magic. No matter what I did in Hawaii, I couldn't get rid of the back pain, right? And a big part of what I was doing there while I was practicing was pranayama. And as you mentioned, I also actually went down and visited the Iyengar Institute while I was there, because of course I wanted to see it while I was there. I'm not an Iyengar practitioner, but you have to see it, right?
It's a sight.
It's a sight, right? So I went down to Pune and checked it out, and yeah, it was great. And but in all of these places, as you say, it's tragic that there's so much air pollution that people are contending with, and what many other people brought, the ailments that many other people brought to the Institute were air pollution borne ailments, like, for example, asthma. I mean, I was meeting people in their 20s who could barely breathe, like in day-to-day life. It was so sad, coming from Mumbai, right? And they would come up to Lonavala, where they would find relative relief because the air is relatively cleaner. But still, when you look, I showed a picture in the book release yesterday. They have this thing called the Asian brown cloud.
Yeah.
That's hanging around India this time of year. And this is the time of year when I was there. I was there in the fall into the winter. And there's no escaping it. There's no escaping it. So here we have this problem of people pranayamically inhaling, as Joseph Alter says, pranayamically inhaling polluted city air to try to fix their ailments that are from polluted air, right? And what's sad about it is that, so the Hatha Yoga logic, if you read it in a Hatha Yoga text, is supposedly clearing our body, our subtle body, and purifying it of these toxins, and that's how it's taught at the Institute. But it's not considering the current moment. Like in medieval Hatha Yoga, they didn't have these air pollution problems that we have now, right? It's not considering, when you bring these texts and these practices into conversation with what's actually happening right now, we have to be a little bit more careful, because what I go into the chapter to show is that today it's very different, right? Obviously, with this air pollution that people are trying to escape. So it's a very difficult situation, and it made me sad being there. I was lamenting, as we do. You know, I'd been to the beach in Orissa. It's not so polluted there like it is in the cities, but being in the cities more and more during my research, just it's a really kind of tragic thing to see the air that people have to breathe routinely, and that people like you and I, as you say, we can come and go, right? So it's not going to have probably a long-term effect on us, but people have to stay, and it's very tragic.
Well, exactly. And I suppose that led me to this question that I touched on earlier about, sort of where the critical thinking takes us, because, in the end, sure, we're privileged, and it's important to acknowledge that we can get on the plane and go to somewhere with better air quality. Although, as you pointed out last night, not necessarily that great either, even in Zurich, which I remember as being pristine. But still, others don't have that choice. They live where they live. They're going to breathe the air anyway. Is it any worse to be doing pranayama?
Yeah, do you mean in the polluted air?
Yeah. So if they're there, and this pranayama potentially has some capacity to improve the quality of the way that they breathe, the fact that they're breathing the bad air is surely the same whether or not they learn the technique.
Yeah, and I think so. There's a couple points in the chapter where I point out that people coming from the cities already know they're breathing in bad air, right? They're not duped and unaware. They're not like, why do I have asthma? They know, people know the air is polluted. I mean,
Sure.
right. And many actually, when they came to Lonavala, found relative relief because it is relatively less polluted. And through certain forms of breathing exercise, you can kind of overcome some of the short acute symptoms of asthma, for example, with various forms of breathing techniques, as I discussed in the chapter, right? So there is, maybe we could say, some moderate relief. People do receive short-term relief, right? But in any case, they're still having to breathe in that polluted air. But the pranayama, in some way, shape, or form, especially doing it up at a hill station, seems to provide at least some relative short-term relief for the manifold issues they experience when they're in the city. So yeah, that's there, right? People are doing that. And like you said, like there was the Guardian article that recently came out about how polluted the air is in Europe. And I'm still practicing pranayama, even though I know that when I look in Zurich, that I'm in like one of these terrible city zones where it's also not safe even to breathe, supposedly. It's not as bad as India, of course. It's like much less worse, but it's still a danger for us to breathe, so to speak. Yeah.
Well, I think you put it into stark relief there and illustrated the problem. I mean, sure, it might not be the safest air to breathe, but what we're going to do, not breathe. So obviously we are where we are. And then the other thing we might try to do is to campaign for better air quality. But we might not get very far with that. So we're still going to carry on breathing. So it's not really an either or thing. And I sometimes get the impression that some of this scholarly discourse around these questions is very black and white indeed, and leaves no space for both and thinking. And I was really struck by that at the end of the pranayama chapter, coming to a theme that we've discussed once before, the prison yoga question, which we can maybe get onto in a minute. But with the pranayama, it was almost using this language of sort of the neoliberal context in which air pollution is arising, and then the necropolitics, the politics of death that is being exported in this way. The implication is that somehow we should just shut down breathing or shut down pranayama, or sure, those contexts exist, but we're still left with the individual question if we have some agency and there's some practices that might help. So why lard on the heavy language of necropolitics?
Yeah. So I guess what I try to show in the conclusion there is that, I'm drawing from other geographers who have done similar things, that there are certain geographical regions in the world, including, I cite one from the United States, for example, in the Mississippi-Louisiana corridor, this kind of Cancer Alley. There are certain what they refer to as death worlds or sacrifice zones, where as a result of some kind of capitalistic practice, whether it's pollution of the water, pollution of the air, pollution of the earth, people in those regions just become sicker and become accustomed to this what Mbembe calls a death world, right? Which means that people become more accustomed to this suffering, this slow suffering and death than people like me in Zurich have to, right? I mean, it's uneven development. It's really not fair, and it's really not so great for those people who can't leave, as we've said, right? So what I try to do in the conclusion is acknowledge, on the one hand, that we might conceive of a place sitting under that Asian brown cloud where people can hardly go outside and breathe as a death world. They're being accustomed. They become used to this, even though they don't like it and it's terrible. They can't leave, and it's just worse off for them, right? The life expectancy is lower. But at the same time, these people are practicing pranayama, as you say, and as I write in the chapter, as a form of individual agency to do what they can, whatever they can, to make life a little bit better despite the fact. And I think yoga and hatha yoga, in their attempt to help us see this world of suffering, which I think is universal since ancient times, right? Human suffering is universal, it just changes how it happens. Yeah. And so in some ways, what I try to do is pay respect to the fact that Kaivalya is still carrying forward this now 100-year tradition, because they've been there for 100 years next year. But of course, these practices go way back before that. They're still simultaneously not giving up hope and still carrying forward these amazing pranayama traditions, despite the fact that they live in one of these sacrifice zones, right? So they're performing, as I argue in the chapter, also a yogic sacrifice of the body, which attempts to kind of release one in some way, shape, or form from this world of suffering in the first place. So I see both of these things happening at the same time. And I want us to be able to look at both at the same time and not throw out the fact that Kaivalya is carrying forward this incredible legacy of pranayama. I hope that came through.
Well, I don't know if it does as clearly as you just put it there, because in some ways there's almost the implication that by choosing to teach pranayama in the sacrifice zones, they are the sacrificers and other unfortunate individuals are the victims. And the parallel that's made with prison yoga was what left me with that conclusion, because there is this sort of implication that by going into prisons, teaching people effectively ways to be more pacific and adapted to their incarcerated circumstances, that one is part of the problem rather than part of any kind of solution. And the implication is that there ought to be an alternative curriculum whereby you would go into prisons and teach people to dismantle the prison state. How on earth they're going to do that from inside a cell, I have no idea whatsoever. And this seems to be, just somewhat, frankly, I'll use the word delusional thinking on the part of scholars who are just making academic arguments for the sake of scoring points or promoting a particular political philosophy, which is fine, but why should people who are in prisons be denied the possibility of being a little bit more at peace with themselves while they're stuck in this unfortunate situation? And why would that necessarily preclude at the same time campaigning for a more humane system of dealing with people who are convicted of crimes? So I sometimes wonder what that language, discourse, even way of seeing brings to our understanding. I wonder if it doesn't actually cloud things more than it reveals.
Yeah, what I would like to do is take up kind of both and, as you're saying. And so first, to start with Kaivalya, I don't think that the people there, especially like the teachers, for example, I don't think that they're like part of the problem, so to speak. I think they're working within the constraints that they have, right? And they aren't like, just like the carceral system, they're not going to shut down the carceral system or end the air pollution themselves, nor do they have the individual responsibility to have to do that. They exist in it, and I think they're using, just much like in prison yoga, they're using the tools that are available to them to provide some form of relief, right? And people reported that in the chapter that they were experiencing some form of relief. So yeah, I actually, in fact, many times when I talk to people, I mentioned this in the book launch last night, at the institution, they were much in favor of the kinds of pranayama practices that were being used at Kaivalya, and were very much opposed to any sort of nationalistic frame of yoga, out of which these problems also emerge, right? At the national level, the economic policies that allow, and the lack of regulation that allow for this pollution to take place. They're actually very much against it because they thought, yoga shouldn't be nationalized. It should be practiced the way we're doing it. So they kind of created a distance between themselves and that, and saw themselves as doing it the way it should be done in this particular place. So, so with regard to prison yoga, I agree with you too. I mean, I think that you know, Farah Godrej recently wrote the book Freedom Inside, which I cite there, and I'm sure you're aware of, and also shows that it's very, I guess, kind of complicated in the sense that people do find relief from prison yoga, right? And nobody should be limited to having the benefits of yoga, or I think any other practice that could bring them some relief while they're in prison, right? And at the same time, why are they there? They're there because of an unjust social system that from the start, as I talk with my students, put them in a place where they didn't have the same advantages that other people have who are not in the prison system. And so, but I don't think we should expect them, people who are incarcerated, or the yoga teachers, to be able to solve the problem of the carceral state, although they could, if they want, vote in a way that would help. For example, as you say, I often just tell my students to vote. If you don't like the carceral system, vote in a way and for people who will try to fix it or make things better. But if you put all that pressure on one teacher or one person, I don't think that's realistic, right? And what I do think is realistic is that you train them so that they're aware of the issues, and that they know that their role is that they're providing, as you say, this kind of relief to people who are suffering extremely in this system.
I guess I brought it up.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
I can't expect a yoga teacher to go in, as you say. I mean, they would be kicked out of the prison if they tried to tear down the prison system. And so it's not their job, I wouldn't say, but they should, I think they should be aware of not creating like self-blame narratives, for example, taking responsibility, over responsibility for your actions, like to the prisoners, right? Coming in as like a white savior or something to just like be like, you know, you're here because of what you did was wrong. I mean, which of course is partially true sometimes, but not always true. I mean, there's larger systems that led to their having to go into prison in the first place, or to not having the same advantages as others. So I think it's both and. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it was that example about self-blame that you did cite, which I guess led me to talk about it, of somebody who broke down in tears thinking I've been part of the perpetuation of this narrative of self-blame. And, you know, to a certain extent, the opposite of that is taking responsibility for oneself, which is often given this, you know, sort of negative tinge of that's, you know, that's what the neoliberals want you to do, and, you know, make everybody individually responsible. There's no social safety net, etc., no acknowledgement of social context. But we all live in a social context and still have to act as autonomous agents. And that social justice language sometimes is very keen to emphasize individual agency, except when it wants to pull it away in order to make a political point. So I find that sometimes jarring, is all I was really trying to say. I'd just like to wrap things up a little bit by coming back to where we started and talking a little bit about being a scholar. You say at the very end of the book, actually, that sort of through critical scholarly engagement as well as through practice, it might be possible to perceive the higher self. And I just wonder what the critical scholarship adds rather than just performing the practices that leads to this you know, perhaps enlightening outcome.
Yeah, so I try to distinguish very swiftly between the para-pratyaksha, the higher experience of perhaps seeing your experiencing your higher self, which would come only through the yoga practices, right? I try to distinguish that from loka pratyaksha, of some kind of knowledge of the empirical world, which is so much what the scholarly pursuit goes after, right? Especially Marxist materialist methods that are just considering social facts and history and hard concrete observation. That's the kind of loka pratyaksha. It's the knowledge we gain through studying what's happening in the world with our five senses, just to put it kind of crudely, right? I think that that's important because it gives us a critical edge, and it allows us to see when things can be potentially problematic. So it allows us to see unjust structures of racism, for example. Like, we can't ignore those things, right? But at the same time, if you're in the prison system, as you're saying, why can't we still teach these? Why can't we just be aware of those things, know that those things are there, even though we might not be able to change them individually, but still teach these embodied techniques and practice these embodied techniques, and perhaps have, as I guess what I'm trying to get at there is the magic again, that there's something that yoga brings that the academic pursuit cannot bring by itself. The academic pursuit is important. Knowledge of the world is important. Science is important. Climate science, for example. These things are important to help us make important decisions and ethical decisions. But is there also something that these practices of yoga bring? And that's the kind of mystery, I guess, I try to leave open at the end of the book, that you can do both together, and perhaps together they form, as I've found in my own experience, a kind of powerful combination of practices that when put together can be transformative, as I said in the book, and enlightening, so to speak.
Oh, thank you. I can get on board with that. And just finally, you're now teaching primarily Jain studies, it seems, at the moment, and you have your own institutes that you've helped to set up for that purpose. And that in itself has a rather enlightened sounding title, as far as I understand. The name Arihanta is referring a bit like Jivamukti yoga to the state of an enlightened being. I wonder if you could just say very briefly what's on offer there, and I'll put a link to that so people can go and explore for themselves.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. So Arihanta Institute is an online educational platform for Jain and yoga studies. We teach yoga studies as well. We have certificate courses, live and self-study. And we also have a master's degree online in what we call engaged Jain studies, where you'll learn about yoga, you'll learn about Jain yoga, you will learn about all things Jain and yoga, basically, through that master's degree program. Arihanta, the word Arihanta is the first of the 5 highest beings in the Jain tradition, or groups of highest beings. And it refers to who I was talking about before, Mahavira, and the Tirthankaras, those like the Buddha who brought these important teachings and did it while they were alive, while they were living, right? So Arihanta comes from the first line of the Namokar mantra, where they say Om Namo Arihantanam. So they're paying obeisance to these teachers who brought these teachings, and what we're trying to do in an academically rigorous way, but also taking into account that we're basically all scholar practitioners of some sort, to study the Jain tradition, kind of bring it into everyday life and apply it to all these various issues that we know that we've talked about today. So thank you so much, Daniel. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Well, likewise, Chris. Thank you again for your time, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. For now, though, wish you all the best.
All right. Namaste.